Before we begin, a quick note. There is an extended version of this episode available on Patreon. It goes into a bit more detail about the political changes in the late Old Kingdom. We also discuss pyramids and trends in their construction, and what they can tell us about the decline of the royal household. To be clear, this public version has all of the essential information to understand the fall of the Old Kingdom, but if you would like some extra discussion around the context, that is available on the Patreon. Link in the episode description. The one buried as a falcon is devoid of offerings. That which the pyramid hid is empty. Behold, the land is deprived of kingship by a few people who ignore all tradition. The crown of Ra is stolen, he who pacifies the two lands. Behold, Egypt has fallen to pouring water in a funeral libation. He who poured water on the ground now seizes the mighty in misery. Behold, the snake is come forth from its hole. Behold, the dead. These are the words of an ancient Egyptian author, written on a papyrus around 1300 BCE. They belong to a text that is commonly known as the Lamentations of Ipuwer, or the Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage. This text is a complicated source. We are not sure exactly when it was first authored or composed, and the subject matter of its lamentations are still a matter of debate among Egyptologists. But whether they are accurately describing a specific historical event, generalizing for the purposes of poetry or propaganda, or something else entirely, they are often used as a good example for the sort of difficulties that might have affected Egypt during the late Old Kingdom and First Intermediate period. In this era, the country supposedly underwent a collapse, with chaos, conflict, and savagery afflicting the land. As we'll see, the realities are far more nuanced, with archaeological and historical material painting a broader picture of a society undergoing a great transformation, but not necessarily one collapsing in upon itself. Still, for some scholars, the Lamentations of Ipuwer are a vibrant and evocative source of something that might be described as a historical trauma, a collective memory of a time in which the kingship of Egypt, one of its most central political and religious institutions, failed to maintain its traditional control over the Nile Valley and surrounding lands. In this time of crisis, so-called, normal social mores may have been upended, and instability may have plagued different parts of the realm. In that sense, the Lamentations of Ipuwer may provide a dramatic punctuation to the story of an ancient society undergoing massive change. As we'll see in this episode, it is a long, drawn-out process, one that was not necessarily all bad for everyone all of the time, but nonetheless wrought a profound change in the wider society and history of the country we call Egypt. In short, whatever their exact historicity, the Lamentations of Ipuwer might capture a cultural memory of the decline and fall of the Old Kingdom. There are three big factors to the decline of the Old Kingdom, and we need to explore these in order to better understand what comes after during the First Intermediate period. The first big problem was climate change, widespread and long-lasting trends in the environmental balance of North Africa and the surrounding region, and these affected the economic prosperity of the Nile Valley and the health of their political institutions. The second factor, which could very well be a response to that climate issue, is political decentralization, a slow movement away from the concentration of resources and power that we saw during the 4th and 5th dynasties, towards a political arrangement that was more fragmented than earlier generations. Finally, these two factors combined contributed to what we perceive as an overall decline in the power and wealth of the royal household. Since the Old Kingdom is defined by its royal monuments and the art produced by its workshops, this is the most visible and dramatic part of the process. But when you're looking at it in the big picture, the decline of the royal household was probably not a cause of widespread political decentralization, but rather a symptom of it. We'll explore this all in more detail as we go, but broadly speaking, these are the three big factors that saw the Old Kingdom decline from its once splendid peak. Again, the science is evolving, and the story will probably change in years to come. But for now, here is where the big picture currently sits. As the old saying goes, Egypt exists because of the Nile, specifically the annual flood or inundation, which sweeps northward from the monsoon rains in Central and Eastern Africa. The rains are not predictable. Sometimes they boom forth, sometimes they are quieter, sometimes they fail altogether. But over time, the pattern is relatively consistent. The monsoons occur, the Nile fills up, and that floodwater slowly flows northward. It passes through the modern lands of South Sudan, and Egypt, and then enters into the Mediterranean Sea. It is a cycle as old as human history, and much older than that, and one which utterly shaped the landscape in this region, and the societies that lived here. Without the flood and the monsoons that fed it, Egyptian society would never have flourished as magnificently as it did. Unfortunately, the earth does not care about that at all, and in the way of all natural phenomena, the monsoon rains and the Nile flood had their rough patches, times when the water did not flow as fast and free as usual, times when the river might rise a little bit, but not enough to overflow its banks, times when the farmland would not automatically get the water, mud, and silt that it craved for new fertility. When that happened, Egyptian society was forced to adapt. When it happened a lot, well, there was trouble. Since the 1960s, Egyptologists have observed a slow decline in the levels of the Nile flood, specifically the flood levels of the Old Kingdom. Our evidence for this comes from the ancient Egyptians themselves. The Old Kingdom bureaucrats kept a regular measurement of the Nile flood or inundation as it began every year, and those measurements survive on a record known as the Palermo Stone. This is a text written in the mid-5th dynasty, around 2400 BCE, and it records major events for all the kings going back into their history. One of those records is the Nile flood, regular measurements of the inundation covering 500 years and more. Looking at the Palermo Stone, scholars have observed certain trends. Most notably, the level of the flood was slowly decreasing. The records begin around 3000 BCE in the First Dynasty, and they end around 2400 when they were carved on the stone. Looking at the measurements for each flood, Egyptologists have observed that gradually, generation by generation, the Nile floods seem to get lower. For example, in the First Dynasty, the flood measurement goes about 2.8 meters above the normal level of the river, whatever the Egyptians considered zero. It was a solid rise that would provide a good flood. But in the Fifth Dynasty, around 2400 BCE, the average height of the Nile flood has dropped by a full meter, down to 1.8 meters above the normal level. That is a more than 30% drop over time. And that's actually a best-case scenario. When you factor in the change in the riverbed, which slowly rises with the accumulation of mud and silt, the Nile flood may have been even lower than 1.8, down to 1.5 or even 1.3 meters above the normal level. In other words, between 3000 and 2400 BCE, the Nile flooding may have decreased by as much as 50 to 60%. To be clear, this drop did not happen overnight. It was gradual, over centuries. Likewise, the actual effect of this diminishing flood probably took a long time to manifest. Even in a bad year, when the inundation was much lower than usual, labor and technology might offset some of the problems. At the micro level, farmers or labourers could lift water manually and pour it into the fields. In the bigger picture, the royal government could organise digging. Armies of labourers could go to work on the land, digging ditches or canals to facilitate water flow. We actually have records of the Egyptians doing just that. During the Old Kingdom, royal records mention the establishment of new farming estates, with hieroglyphs that define it as an area of irrigated land. In the 4th dynasty, a mid-level overseer named Dedi had to organize a massive digging project near the Great Pyramid of Giza. The team was tasked with digging or expanding canals and waterways to facilitate easy transport of goods. We even have art from the early days of kings digging canals or irrigation to help develop the farmland. In short, the Egyptians were not helpless in the face of change. The floods might be decreasing slowly with an occasional bad year, but with hard work the ancients could soften or even delay the impact, at least for a while. In the long term, the diminishing flood was kind of a slow-moving catastrophe. Year by year, inch by inch, the floodwaters would reach slightly less farmland than before. The amount of silt and mud deposited on the fields got thinner and thinner over time, and slowly, ever so slowly, the harvests would begin to shrink. Again, nothing too visible in a single year, or even 10 years or 20, but in the long term, it seems like the Egyptian kingdom was probably squeezed at its most basic level. The agricultural foundation of the state became weaker and weaker. For the ordinary folk, this slow decay would inevitably result in hardship. If the farmland was less productive, then families had less food to go around. And for people whose wages were paid by the state, like royal artisans or stonemasons, their basic needs would be more and more difficult to meet. The Lamentations of Ipuwer describe the effects of this, with society collapsing under its own impoverishment, people crying out due to hunger, and folks raiding granaries in order to gain the food they so desperately need. Then, in the First Intermediate period, this becomes a major focus of local administration. Rulers spend a lot of time ensuring that their people have enough food and supplies. In one noteworthy example, a man named Jari will be dispatched by his ruler to travel up and down the Nile Valley and use his eloquent speaking skills to barter for food that he can bring back to the city. Situations like this seem to crop up repeatedly during the First Intermediate period, and assuming that not all of these sources are exaggerating the problem, they are almost certainly the long-term effects of a declining Nile flood. So we have the royal annals that provide a fairly regular record of the inundation level. Then we also have historical sources that hint at widespread hardship and social anxiety over the availability of food. Putting these together, we do get a general picture of ancient Egyptian society during this time, one suffering the effects of a decreasing river level. And as the farmland becomes less and less productive, the wider society suffers as a result. In these circumstances, it is not hard to see how the royal household, which supported itself on the basis of agriculture in large royal estates and the taxation of communities up and down the river, would slowly weaken and suffer as resources became harder and harder to obtain. And when the royal household itself employs a huge number of people to build its monuments and act in its name, the scarcity of those resources would slowly erode the institutions of the kingship. If low Nile floods did cause a decrease in productivity, this may inevitably have led to food shortages and perhaps famine. We may have a cultural memory of this in the Lamentations of Ipuwer, who describes a situation in which Egypt is afflicted with widespread death and hunger. Writing centuries later, the author of Ipuwer said the following, quote, "Blood is everywhere. There is no end of death. The death shroud summons, even though one's time has not yet come. Indeed, countless corpses are entombed in the river. The waters are a tomb, and the place of embalming is the river. Grain is depleted everywhere, and people are deprived of clothing, perfume, and oil. Everyone says, "There is nothing left." The storehouse is bare, its attendant lies stretched out on the earth, i.e., dead. Indeed, the government offices are opened, their records are pillaged. The scribes of the land register, their records are destroyed. The grain of Egypt is up for grabs. The second part of our climate catastrophe comes from the desert. Archaeologists working in northern Egypt have observed a distinct trend of sand accumulation during the Old Kingdom. This is visible at multiple sites, including Giza, Sahara, Dashur, Abusia, and the ruins of Memphis, the old royal residence. Archaeological excavations and laboratory studies have discovered a great deal of evidence for the Sahara expanding and gradually pushing inward on the fertile Nile Valley. To give a bit of context, Egypt today is much drier than it was 5,000 years ago. Around 3000 BCE and the start of the Old Kingdom, many parts of Egypt were more fertile than they are now. Not forests or grasslands or anything, but more like scrub and savanna, areas where the water table was a bit closer to the surface, allowing small stands of trees and rough desert foliage along the edges of the Nile Valley. In the past 5,000 years or so, that savanna region has largely disappeared, and there is a much sharper contrast between the fertile region and the sands. So during the Old Kingdom, Egypt had a slightly more moderate climate with a greater variety of landscapes than what we see today. That's the important context. But just like the Nile Valley, that began to change. Archaeologists working in various sites in northern Egypt have observed periods in which sand accumulation seems to increase rapidly. The sand is blowing eastward from the Sahara, and in certain monumental sites like Dashur or Giza, archaeologists find regions where the sand has piled up very quickly within the space of a single human lifetime. They can date these accumulated sands from diagnostic material, items like pottery sherds or organic material that is buried beneath the sand layer. So, for example, if they excavate a site which has 4th dynasty pottery underneath a layer of clean sand, we know that around that time the desert was expanding into that particular zone. If researchers find an area with a mix of artifacts, say 4th and 5th and 6th dynasty, we have a sense of the ancients clearing the sand out of a particular location in order to keep using it. I've simplified that, but you get the idea. Working on particular sites, archaeologists have found evidence that during the Old Kingdom, the desert was encroaching. Like the declining level of the Nile flood, this wasn't necessarily an immediate, sudden catastrophe. But just like the Nile flood lowering, it was a long-term, slow-moving disaster. At the exact moment that the river was not reaching quite the same extent as previously, the outer edges of the fertile valley were slowly being covered in a layer of dry, desiccating material. This would have affected villages and communities living along the edge of that fertile region, and anybody who made their living out in the oases or traveling the desert paths would have found their journeys more difficult on a day-to-day basis. And as the sand and salt slowly dried out the edges of the farmland, this would have exacerbated the issues with fertility and productivity that we discussed earlier. So, while the sand was not necessarily blowing in a great sandstorm, the slow tendency towards aridification would have gone hand in hand with the reduced Nile flood to gradually undermine the fertility, productivity, and stability of the Old Kingdom society. It also would have had a knock-on effect that isn't immediately apparent, but which does appear in the Egyptian sources. People do live in the deserts, both then and now, and especially during the Old Kingdom, when the Sahara was much more supportive of scrubland and savanna, you would have had much larger communities of nomads or Bedouin moving through the region. But in times of hardship, when that local environment can no longer sustain the population, people tend to move out of those regions. Again, this appears in the Lamentations of Ipuwer, who might not be describing this exact sequence of events, but may preserve a cultural memory or anxiety about these trends. Ipuwer said, quote, "Indeed, the desert pervades the land. The districts are annihilated. Foreigners have come into Egypt. Behold, the Easterners have arrived in the land, and now there are no Egyptians anywhere. Indeed, the entire Delta region in the north, there is nothing protected there anymore, and northern Egypt relies on roads that are freely traveled by anyone. What can be done? There is no means of escape in any place. Behold, the land is under the control of the impious, just as it was under the pious. And nomads are now the experts in the professions of the Delta. Behold, no function is in its proper place. It is like a herd of animals wandering aimlessly without its herder." Over several centuries, the climate and environment of North Africa and neighboring regions slowly changed, with a general tendency towards drought and lower water levels. Naturally, in an agricultural economy like that of Egypt, this had a knock-on effect on society and their political hierarchy. I could talk about this for several hours, but I'm going to keep it relatively simple. The big overarching trend that we need to be aware of is decentralization. Starting around the end of the 4th dynasty, just after the great Giza pyramids, we begin to see a rise in the visibility and wealth of high-ranking officials and courtiers. Previously, the royal family tended to dominate the government institutions. Sons and brothers of the reigning monarch would monopolize power and control the various bureaucracies and departments. However, after the 4th dynasty, that changes quite dramatically and suddenly, and powerful nobles with no visible connection to the royal family begin to gather influence and wealth in their own hands. The trend continues into the 6th dynasty, the time of kings like Pepi II. In this era, we continue to see powerful courtiers who build magnificent tombs in the royal cemeteries. But noticeably, there are far fewer of them in this period compared to the earlier 5th dynasty. Instead, archaeologists have observed that during the 6th dynasty, other provincial cemeteries outside of the royal centers seem to grow rapidly, as if the wealthy and powerful are abandoning the royal palace and its surrounding necropolis and building their tombs closer to their home communities. This part of the story is still being uncovered and systematically explored by various scholars, but broadly speaking, during the 6th dynasty period, around 2250 BCE, it does seem like the wealthy and powerful nobles are no longer building their tombs close to that of the king. Instead, they are moving to other distant centers. There are different interpretations for why this might be happening. In one view, the nobles might have abandoned the royal center because, as the king declined in power and wealth, he was no longer able to support them in the construction of magnificent tombs. There is some evidence for this. During the 6th dynasty, we occasionally see high-ranking officials reusing tombs of their predecessors, as if they can no longer afford to build them for themselves. In one case, a man called Iri, or Teti Soneb, constructed a small monument for his burial, and he left a hieroglyphic inscription describing this project. Iri said, quote, "I made payment to the stonemason, and I did it so that he was satisfied on account of it. But I did the work in the tomb with my own hands, together with my children and my brothers." End quote. From this passage, it sounds as though Iri was able to afford the basic raw stone for his monument, but he was not able to pay anybody else to do the decoration or the rest of the construction. In the event, Iri and his family had to work together to build the monument. For scholars like Naguib Kanawati and Joyce Swinton, writing in 2018, texts like these might be small hints at the overall impoverishment of the ruling class. The powerful nobles close to the king could no longer access the resources that their forebears had done, and as a result, their burial halls declined in size, splendor, and decoration. We also see that in the royal monuments themselves. During the 4th dynasty, the age of the Great Pyramids, those royal tomb complexes had reached the absolute pinnacle of size, with the Great Pyramid topping out at 150 meters tall. By contrast, the royal pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties tend to be much smaller, about 50 meters high on average. They also show a gradual decline in the quality of their masonry, with smaller blocks of stone and less complicated architecture internally. This has meant that the monuments of this period have decayed much worse than those of the Grand 4th dynasty. And if you are looking at things architecturally, this could be another marker of the slow impoverishment of the royal household. They simply don't have the resources to invest in these monuments as they once did. By contrast, the regional cemeteries that I just mentioned, they seem to grow in splendor. During the early and middle Old Kingdom, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th dynasties, those provincial cemeteries tend to be relatively small and not particularly glamorous in terms of their tombs. In the 6th dynasty, however, we start to see enormous tomb complexes for regional officials. Cemeteries like Akhmin, Asyut, Thebes or Waset, and Elephantine or Aswan have magnificent monuments for their local elites. So if you are purely looking at the architecture and the monuments, it seems like the royal centers are declining while everyone else is gaining. And since monumental construction is one of the grand hallmarks of the Old Kingdom, this is a common motif in discussions of the fall. One thing we must make clear: the impoverishment of the royal center was not necessarily the impoverishment of all. The fact that the regional cemeteries are surviving, even thriving, during this period might simply indicate that resources are no longer being centralized in the manner they had before. As the royal house weakens in its authority and control, it is less able to hoover up wealth to sustain enormous building projects. In that sense, the decline of the royal center might have been a boon for the elite and noble periphery. Again, this is a large and complicated discussion that is still being untangled from various perspectives within the scholarship. I could go much deeper into this, and one day I would very much like to, but to keep it simple and manageable, we must emphasize the decline of the royal household at the end of the Old Kingdom was not necessarily a calamity for all. Nonetheless, the idea of general decline, the impoverishment of the wealthy, and the fall of the kingship as a legitimate institution, these are common motifs within that text, the Lamentations of Ipuwer. Although it probably doesn't describe the late Old Kingdom or First Intermediate period exactly, it may preserve cultural memories or ideas of that time, and some of the descriptions are quite evocative. To round out this episode, we will let Ipuwer summarize some of the calamities that might have afflicted his civilization. Quote, "The doorkeepers say, 'We shall go out and pillage.' Even faithful servants, their hearts have become indignant, and the magistrates, or judges, do not satisfy their people when they cry out in need. Behold, the noble ones are in lamentation, while the wretched ones are in glee, and every city says, 'Let us drive out the mighty one from our midst.' Behold, the son of a man whose name is known now lacks recognition. Builders arrive, but they depart as mere farmers. Behold, the road to the tomb lies open. Even bodies that were in the tombs are cast out into the desert, and the skills of the embalmers are undone. The roads are avoided, and the paths are ambushed. Men crouch in the bushes until the arrival of a traveller at night. They do this in order to seize his burden and to take what he is carrying. He is attacked with blows of a cudgel, and he is murdered most cruelly. The grain is depleted everywhere. People are deprived of clothing, perfume, and oil, and everyone says, there is nothing left. Rejoicing is perished, and no longer arises. It is grief that pervades the land, mingled with lamentation. Everyone's hair has become thin, and no one can tell an honourable man from one who is worthless. Deeds are now done which have never before occurred. The king has been overthrown by the rabble. That which the pyramid once held will now be found wanting. The land begins to lose the kingship at the hands of a few men who ignore tradition. Behold now, there arises rebellion, and the royal residence could fall at any moment. If only this were the end of humanity, no more conceiving, no more giving birth. Then the land would be quietened from its discord, and its turmoil would be no more." End quote. At the very limit of the drama, the author of the Lamentations briefly wondered if it might not be better for humanity to cease entirely. The collapse of social order, the destruction of lives, the fall of the kingship, these ideas could not be sustained in a healthy, orderly society. You have to wonder if, during the late Old Kingdom, some in the royal household might have thought the same. Ipuwer speaks of an entire world afflicted by suffering and dissolution. As we have seen in this episode, that is not strictly accurate for the late Old Kingdom, for the decline of the royal household was a problem for the king and his family, but was not necessarily a widespread calamity for the people. That being said, archaeological and ecological evidence does paint a more complicated and depressing picture. Over the course of the Old Kingdom, parts of Egypt were afflicted by a gathering drought as the Nile flood began to decrease, and certain regions suffered the expansions of the Sahara. These problems may not have affected the entire country at once, and they may have transpired over several generations rather than in one calamitous event. With that in mind, the Lamentations of Ipuwer, if they do describe this period at all, probably condense the processes of many generations into one dramatic tale. And yet, the cultural memory of this time, the decay of a once splendid royal house, may have had long-lasting effects on the memories of its people. For a historical period that is so clearly defined by the power of its monarchy and the splendor of its monuments, the late Old Kingdom can seem like a calamitous decline and fall. The reality may be more nuanced, but the memory still has its power. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. Next week, we begin our journey through the First Intermediate Period, a short mini-series of episodes exploring the collapse of centralized power and the conflicts that erupted along the Nile Valley. Then, following that mini-series, we return to the New Kingdom. It's been a bit longer than I anticipated, but we are going back to the reign of Seti I, the age of Ramesses II, and the great society they built. Before I go, I would like to thank the priests, my top-tier supporters on patreon.com. These fine folks help to keep the gods satisfied, to avoid tempests and desertification in my own life. My special thanks to Arthur, James, Veronica, Ashley, Neden, Kyla, Andy and Chelsea, Mykost, Yola, TJ, Terry, Eric, and Linda. Folks, you are all too generous. May your farms and fields flourish without any drought or hardship. May your household remain strong. May your kingdom last forever. To everyone listening, thank you so much for joining me. Onwards to an age of battles.